Okay, we're on Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy, Book 3, which is about true happiness and Neoplatonic philosophy. So, Lady Philosophy says she will now lead Boethius to true happiness that his soul dreams of, but that you can't see because your sight is distracted by images. At this point, she then tells a poem about how we appreciate what we get more if we are first deprived of it. The poem goes, "Whoever cultivates a virgin field must first clear away the brush and the weeds and cut with a sickle the ferns and brambles to enable Ceres to come with her seeds of nourishing grain. The taste in the mouth of honey is sweeter by far if it follows something bitter, and stars in the sky are all the brighter after the dark storm clouds have been blown away by a steady wind from the south. The morning star is a beacon that shines down at dawn to welcome the glory of Phoebus' shining steeds, and you too must prepare yourself for change, withdraw your neck from the yoke of your false gods, and raise your head in order that truth may enter." Chapter 2 of Book 3 talks about false ways of pursuing happiness. So she says, what all men want, although they seek it by different routes and through different activities, is to be happy. That is the summum bonum, the supreme good, the one that leaves room for no other good. But men are led astray by false ideas of what is good. So some false ideas of what is good include wanting nothing, having lots of stuff, or self-sufficiency, we might say. 2 would be honor, seeking honor. 3 would be great power. 4 would be fame. And 5 would be joy, good spirits, and pleasure. So men look to get these things thinking that this will bring them happiness, but in the end, these things by themselves do not bring happiness. People assume that what they want, will bring them happiness. Once they get it, they long for something thinking that it's going to bring them happiness, and they assume once they get that thing that they will be happy. And people are not all wrong to want these things that are listed above, and to think that they will cause happiness. There is something to it because each of these things does bring benefits in life, which makes life easier in some ways. At the end of chapter 2, on page 64 and 65, she recites a poem about how each thing in the world seeks to end where it began. You might remember at the beginning of the book, she had talked to Boethius about how he remembered where he came from, that is, that God created the world and God created him, but he didn't know where he was going. And so she's giving him a clue here that where he came from is also where he needs to be going if he wants true happiness. Where he came from, he was created by God. Where he needs to be going to find true happiness is back to God. Chapter 3 of Book 3 is about wealth. So natural inclinations draw us toward the true good, but mistaken ideas often confuse you and lead you in the wrong direction. And so people pursue becoming wealthy. People think that wealth, money, and the things that come with it, a nice home, nice car, will make them self-sufficient. In other words, it will make them independent, so that they don't need anybody else, but they'll be able to survive on their own. But it doesn't make them self-sufficient. Instead, once a man has a lot of wealth, he has a lot to worry about. He has to worry about losing it. So he needs protection from robbers, fraud, lawsuits, accidents. But if you didn't have any money, you wouldn't need any protection, as you would have nothing to lose. So you become dependent on other people to protect your wealth, which is the opposite of self-sufficiency. Having wealth doesn't actually get rid of need. Instead, it creates avarice in the soul, which is the desire to acquire more and more. So there is an old saying that if you have a lot, there's a lot you haven't got. So there's always more that you could get, and the person that gets in the habit of wanting lots of things, of becoming wealthy, always has a need to get more. He's never completely satisfied. Chapter 4 is about high offices and positions of power. This is another way that people think that they're going to find happiness, is by rising to positions of power. Holding positions of power doesn't make a person virtuous, nor does it bring respect. These are both myths. We admire a person. What we admire in a person is virtue, whether they're a good person or not. If a corrupt person holds a high office, which is often the case, they are not necessarily respectable or worthy. And then she gives the example of a former consul, a very high-ranking Roman official who visits barbarian tribes. The barbarians would not hold him in esteem, as they see only the man, and they don't know about or comprehend his office of being a consul. At the end, she has a poem about Nero, who held great power, but was not respected or liked because of his evilness. With fancy clothes, jewels, and gaudy badges, Nero strutted along the streets, hated by all who could see through all the fancy get-up to his mean heart, shameless and toward the end probably crazy. He foisted fools and villains upon the disgusted Senate as consuls, but what did those empty honors mean? Chapter 5 of Book 3 is about kings, and everyone thinks that if they were king, they would be happy. But is it really good to be a king? Their power is actually not unlimited, it is limited. And where their power ends, there lies unhappiness. A king of Syracuse named Dionysius said that being a king was like having a sword above your head. There was a man in his kingdom named Damocles who told him that he thought it would be great to be king. And Dionysius agreed to change places with him for a day. But as part of the deal, he insisted that a sword be hung by a horse's hair over Damocles' head the entire time, so that he would get the true feeling of what it's like to be a king. What good is power if it is a constant source of worry and fear? Is a king really powerful if they need to have bodyguards everywhere that they go? Even those who are not kings themselves, but simply work for the king as an advisor, are insecure. As soon as the king dies, their life is in jeopardy. And even while he is alive, they are at the king's mercy. He could turn on them at any time. Some examples she gives are that Nero turned on Seneca and forced him to commit suicide, and Caracalla executed his longtime courtier Papinian. So what good is power if you have always to live in fear for your life? Kings also can't really trust their friends, because their friends are drawn to them not by love, not by true love, but by the power that they have. They see that power, they want to get part of that power, and so they're drawn to become friends with the king. And they will abandon the king as soon as his fortune turns. So if the king is overthrown, he can't count on any of his friends to protect him anymore. Chapter 6 is about glory, fame, and nobility, and how they are deceptive and vulgar. So many people's great reputations are based on the judgments of the mob, the common people. What can be more vulgar than that, says Lady Philosophy. And many people are talked about at a great deal by the public, but they would be ashamed to hear what was said about them. You might think about modern politicians who are often talked about quite a bit in the news, but it's usually bad stuff that's said about them. Nobility is vain, as it comes from fame, which is temporary, or from your parents, and therefore is borrowed. So the nobility are people, lords and ladies, who were high-ranking in medieval society, But they got that position either because they were born into it or just because they were famous, which is a temporary thing. So all fame really does in the end, she says, is to make you famous, which is meaningless. So on page 75, she has a poem about how all men are equal, and fame and nobility are not very meaningful. All mankind comes from the same stock. You are children of one Father who rules over all and cares for all his sons and daughters. Why should anyone boast of his forebears or his family distinctions? All of you can claim as ancestors and author the God who made you. So, in other words, God is the Father of all people, and therefore all men are equal. And so nobility, glory, and fame, in that sense, have no real meaning. Chapter 7 is about bodily pleasure. So again, we're going over here, what Lady Philosophy has been going over here is different ways that people think will make them happy in life. They pursue wealth, high offices, becoming a king, glory, fame, bodily pleasures is the next one. All of these are ways that people pursue happiness, and all of them are kind of dead ends. So Lady Philosophy says that indulging the body usually brings about pain and disease. Examples would be overeating, drinking too much, drugs, rich food, sexual promiscuity. These things bring temporary bodily pleasure, but in the end they bring pain and disease, heart disease, venereal disease, drug overdoses which kill you, liver disease from drinking too much. Many different examples, and most of them are caused directly from overindulgence in bodily pleasure. And she says even children, which is a more innocent form of pleasure for a person, can cause their parents to worry a lot. And so even children are not always a good thing to pursue, according to Lady Philosophy. Chapter 8. Another thing that people think will make them happy is being beautiful or being strong. She says all these paths that we think lead to happiness are false trails and cannot take us where we want to go. Human beauty doesn't last. We only have it for a short time, and it can be easily destroyed by sickness or an accident. Human strength is puny compared to animals, tigers, lions, elephants, and also fades with time. If someone had great sight and could see through the surface, even the body, she says, of Alcibiades, who is a famously handsome man from Socrates' dialogues, would not be attractive, but would just be a pile of organs. So it isn't the human body, she says, that is so attractive, but the fact that our sight is so weak that we think it is. In Chapter 9, Lady Philosophy goes over false ways of pursuing true happiness. She wants to lead him to show him what true happiness really is, but she first wants to show him why false ways to happiness don't work. And basically, there's these 4 basic types of things that people are pursuing, thinking that they are going to be happy. Power, self-sufficiency, respect, and fame. But happiness, she says, is simple, an undivided thing by nature. You can't really divide it into parts. And each one of these 4 things would be parts of happiness. Human error distorts it by trying to divide it into these pieces. So happiness is not divisible into the parts of power, self-sufficiency, respect, and fame. People falsely think that these things will give them happiness, but in fact, happiness cannot be divided into parts. All of these things simultaneously are needed as part of happiness. Any one of them lacking would lead to unhappiness, because these are attributes of happiness. So she then gives some examples on page 81 and 82. The man who is trying to escape neediness wants to be rich, but he doesn't give much thought to power. He prefers to be obscure, and he denies himself pleasure and indulgence so as not to lose any of the money that he has managed to acquire. But in this way he can't be happy because he is powerless, vulnerable, abject, and obscure. Similarly, a man who wants only power squanders his wealth. He doesn't care about fame, which he thinks is worthless. And sometimes he lacks the basic necessities of life. And he worries a lot, which means that he has lost the thing he was trying to gain, which was to be powerful. You can make the same argument about any of these aspects of happiness, for each one is like the other, in that it in isolation is inadequate. Whoever seeks one of these things apart from the other doesn't even get the one he was hoping for. So happiness is not to be sought in any of its individual aspects. So Lady Philosophy says that happiness cannot be divided into its parts. True happiness would be that which makes a man self-sufficient, powerful, respected, famous, and happy. That is full and perfect happiness. But there is nothing in this world that can provide all of that at once. So Plato in Timaeus says that we ought to ask God's help even in the smallest matters. And so the chapter ends with a prayer to God, and the prayer ends with the idea that God is our end, our goal in life. Here's a little bit of the prayer. O Lord, you govern the universe with your eternal order. You brought time itself into being, and all that marks its changes in heavens and here on earth, both moving and also in stillness. And it ends, to the blessed who alone behold it, you are the sole serene goal in which we may rest, satisfied and tranquil, and to see your face is our only hunger, our only thirst. For you are our beginning, our journey, and our end. So she reveals here that being able to see God in heaven is the only true happiness. Okay, chapter 10. Chapter 10 is about perfect good and perfect happiness. Where can perfect happiness be found? Can perfect good exist in this world? If there are imperfect things in the world, there must also be perfect things. The universe progresses from the perfect to the less perfect over time. This is devolution or entropy. Entropy is disorder, or the second law of thermodynamics, which says that disorder necessarily increases over time. So because the universe originates from God's creation, we can know that God is the perfect good from which all things come. God creates the world. He's perfect. He creates creation in a more perfect way, and over time it becomes corrupted. That's entropy. That's devolution. That's disorder increasing over time, which necessarily happens. Where does God, the highest order, where does God is the highest good, so where does God, the highest good, come from? Did somebody else create him? If he were to have received his goodness from some external source, then that source would be more good than God. But this cannot be. So God's goodness comes from within him. So Lady Philosophy says happiness is the highest good, and God is the highest good. Therefore, happiness is God. There cannot be two highest goods that are different from each other, God and happiness, for then neither of them would be the highest. So therefore, God and happiness are actually the same. The pursuit of happiness, therefore, is the pursuit of divinity, the pursuit of God. Men become God, she says, through participation in divinity. This is awkward because God by his nature is one, he's singular. But this does not prevent men from participating in his divinity. And what she would be talking about here is our participation in his divinity in heaven. So aspects of happiness include self-sufficiency, power, respect, fame, and pleasure. But you can't really divide happiness into pieces in reality. When men seek these things, self-sufficiency, power, respect, fame, and pleasure, they are actually seeking goodness. the substance of God is goodness, which means that when men seek these things, they are actually seeking God, even if they don't realize it. At the end of chapter 10, she reads, this is on page 91 and 92, she recites a poem about Plato's cave allegory. Come out, you prisoners, loose from your chains and shame. Come out together into the light and the air, freed from the bonds of desire. Here find rest and a refuge at last from the pain of your unremitting labors, the only sanctuary there is. The riches are elsewhere, and the glorious shining you search for is not to be found in the earth's caves. The grandeur of heaven eludes the corrupted soul, and only those who can see with their eyes and their minds can observe this light brighter than any sun. So here Lady Philosophy is showing that men who are pursuing happiness by going after power, self-sufficiency, respect, and fame are similar to the men here who on the left who are chained to a pole by their necks, looking at shadows on the wall. They're pursuing something that is kind of just a shadow of reality, but not the real thing. But someone who pursues God instead is pursuing the real good, the real happiness, is like one who becomes free from the chains and escapes from the cave and goes out to see the real world rather than just the fake world of the cave. And this was one of Plato's most famous allegories. Chapter 11 is about unity. Unity is required for the good. All things seek the good. On page 93, Lady Philosophy gives a summary of what they have agreed so far. We have agreed that the things most men seek are not true and perfect goods, because they differ from one another, and therefore each is incomplete. Because any one of them lacks the others, and therefore none can be the total and absolute good. On the other hand, true good includes all the goods gathered together into one form, which as a sufficient cause produces a sufficiency which is identical to and includes power, respect, fear, pleasure, and the rest. But unless they are all the same, they are not worth pursuing. So she says unity is required for existence. She gives the example of in a living body, for instance, in a living thing, for instance, while the body and the soul are united together and remain together, the result is that the thing is alive. And if the body and soul are separated from each other, you have disunity, the creature perishes, it dies, and no longer is a living thing. So everything that is alive strives to stay alive. Nothing dies willingly. Even plants and trees strive to stay alive. On page 95, she gives an example. Some plants grow in fields, and others on mountains or in marshes, and some clings to stones, and some grow in the barren sands. And if they were transplanted to a place you or I would think of as likelier for vegetation, they would die. Nature gives each plant what it is appropriate for it, and keeps it alive as long as possible. So she says, even the earth and stones strive to stay together. So survival is a natural principle. All things try to survive. Unity, staying together as a body, for instance, is required for survival. And good is the goal of all things. All things are striving towards the good. So then she ends this chapter with the myth of air from Plato. And this is on page 97 and 98. Plato's muse tells us the secret. Those things that men once knew and thought that they had lost can be remembered. Here's the poem. Whoever with profound contemplation seeks the truth and wants to avoid misleading paths must turn his vision inward. so that his quest may circle back and instead of wandering far, seek that treasure stored in his own heart. What errors dark clouds had covered over will then blaze forth with Apollo's own brightness. That light of mind was never altogether dimmed by heavy flesh that causes men to forget the seeds of truth that were never lost, and that teaching can revive to blossom again. How else can it be that when you are asked a question, something deep within you answers correctly unless those seeds remained there? Plato's muse tells us the secret. Those things that men once knew and thought that they had lost can be remembered. So the myth of air, in case you don't know it, is a myth about people who have died, and they are given a choice after they have died of what life they will live in their next life. Plato, you might not be familiar with this idea, but Plato believed in reincarnation, which he talks about in the Republic, where he has the myth of air, and also in Phaedo, and other places also. And so he believed that after men died, they would either get a better life the next time or a worse life. Anyway, the end of the myth of air, Odysseus is given the final choice. After everybody else has already made a choice of which life they would lead, Odysseus is given the final choice, so presumably there's not many good choices left for him. But he goes and he finds someone who is just a simple farmer and chooses that life. And he says that if he had been the very first to pick, he would have picked the same one, because he'd already experienced the life of someone who lived a glorious, famous life, and he realized it's not all it's cracked up to be, and he really just wished for a simple life, which he felt would be the best of all. But the myth of air also is the idea that when Plato has the idea that learning is when we learn things, it's often not so much that we're learning new things, but that we are remembering what we had forgotten, presumably in Plato's mind from a previous life. Or from a Christian perspective, we might say we are remembering what we have forgotten because God has implanted it in our hearts. And so these things can be remembered. And this is why the Socratic method of education is often not so much teaching people what to think as it is having discussions with them and trying to draw the truth out of them, as if the truth was somehow inside of them already, and they just needed to remember it or to draw it out. So the things that men once knew and thought they had lost can be remembered. Chapter 12 talks about the rule of God over the universe. On page 99, she gives a review of how the universe is ruled by God. It seems to me that the universe is composed of so many different parts that it could never have come together unless there was one to join all of these elements. That would be God. All these diverse and even contrary pieces of the world would fly apart if there was not one, God, who held together what he had originally conjoined. Without God, there could not be so orderly a series of natural processes with intricate motions in place and time unless there was one who imposed and maintained this order. And whatever it is that created and maintains the universe, I call by the name of God. So Boethius is saying here that he believes in God, and he believes that God created and maintains the universe. So God orders all things for the good, and this is the tiller and the rudder by which the universe is preserved. This is on page 100. All things voluntarily submit to God's rule since they aspire to goodness. Nothing would willingly try to oppose God. When people do things against God, in other words, they do it out of ignorance. and not because they think that they're going against God, which makes sense because people usually won't do things unless they feel they have a valid reason for doing them. There's always a justification even for doing evil things. So she tells the story at this point of the giants who challenged heaven, but were put in their place. And in Greek mythology, the giants were created to overthrow the Olympian gods. They had a battle against them, and with the help of Heracles, the Olympian gods defeated the giants and killed them, and the giants became mountains. Evil is, then she goes on to say that evil is nothing because God cannot do it. So God can do everything, but he cannot do evil. So therefore, evil must be nothing. So then at the end towards the end of the book, page 102 to 103, she gives a summary of all the arguments this far. A while ago you said that happiness was the highest good, and you placed that in God, and argued that God was the highest good and complete happiness. And where we came out was that no one could be happy unless he was also a God. Then we talked about the substance of God and of happiness, and we worked it out that unity was the same thing as good, which was what the entire natural world aspired to, unity. And you argued that God ruled the universe with the tiller of goodness, and that all things voluntarily obeyed him. And then we get to the place where evil doesn't exist. This involves no external proofs and demonstrations, but is internally consistent with the arguments, each one of which validates the other. She then ends the book 3 with a poem on page 103 to 105 about Orpheus and Eurydice in the underworld. So the poem at the end of the book is about Orpheus and Eurydice in the underworld. So Orpheus is a man who falls in love with a girl named Eurydice, and she gets bitten by a snake and dies. And he's so distraught by her death that he mourns over it day and night. He finally makes a journey to the underworld and talks to Hades, the god of the dead, about it. And Hades agrees that he will give Eurydice back to Orpheus under just one condition. She needs to follow him out of the underworld. They can't hold hands or stand side by side. She has to follow behind him. And he has to look forward the whole time and walk forward without looking back to see if she's still there. Orpheus thinks this is no big deal and agrees to those terms, and they start making their way out of Hades. And just as he gets close, but as they're making their way out, he doesn't hear Eurydice behind him anymore, and he thinks that the gods may have fooled him. And so just as they're about to leave Hades, he peeks back behind him to see if she's still there, which sends her back into the underworld forever. And she's now unrecoverable, and he's not able to enter a second time to try again. So that's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And this old familiar tale, she says, is yours as you make your ascent, leading your minds to the light. For if in a moment of weakness you should look back on the darkness, the excellence you have achieved, you will lose looking back, looking down. So the lesson is, when ascending towards the light, that is, towards God, don't look back towards darkness and sin. Okay, so starting in book 3, Boethius, in the previous chapter, he had talked about Stoicism, which is basically the idea that we should expect that things are going to go wrong and accept that as part of life. And then in book 3, though, he goes into the philosophy of Neoplatonism. Now, he doesn't really ever name these philosophies and say, yeah, this is the philosophy I'm laying out for you. But it's pretty clear that Neoplatonic philosophy is the school of philosophy that he most closely embraces of the Greek schools of philosophy. Neoplatonic philosophy was introduced by a philosopher named Plotinus,
but it's based on the teachings of Plato, and from his writings that people would read, and it was also adopted by Christians later. The basic idea behind Neoplatonism, and where it goes further than Stoicism, it's related to Stoicism, is that yeah, bad things will happen in life, but God is in control of everything, and if we seek God, we'll ultimately get to the ultimate happiness or good that we're trying to get to. Um, so, so Neoplatonism in that way is much more religious than Stoicism, which tends to be more religiously neutral. All right, and I'd like to talk briefly about Neoplatonism. Neoplatonic philosophy was introduced by the philosopher Plotinus, who lived between AD 204 and 270, so in the 3rd century AD. And a lot of Neoplatonic philosophy was later adopted or Christianized by Christians, including St. Augustine and St. Boethius. And a lot of chapter 3 is going over Neoplatonic philosophy as it relates to Christianity, or I should say book 3. So ideas of Neoplatonic philosophy used by Boethius in book 3. The one. Neoplatonists believe in one God. Neoplatonists believe that the world is a copy of an ideal reality, which is heaven, that exists beyond the material world, which is earth. And this might remind you of the Plato's cave, where you could look at the shadows on the wall in the cave, or you can go out and look at the real world. So one is like the earth. The world, the material world, is just the shadows of the true reality, which is heaven. Other items in Neoplatonic philosophy that are interesting is the soul. Neoplatonists believe that the soul is immortal and pre-exists. Boethius talks about remembering what we have forgotten. This comes from the idea that the soul would pre-exist in Neoplatonic philosophy. The Christian version of this is not that the soul would have pre-existed, but that God would imprint the soul with certain things that it knows by nature, like, for instance, what is right or wrong, or our conscience. But the original Neoplatonists believed that the soul had pre-existed before it came into the body, and sometimes even in previous lives. And we're going to get into that in the next part about reincarnation. It has the soul has two parts: a higher rational soul and a lower irrational soul. The soul is believed to return to God after death, and the level it occupies in the afterlife corresponds to the level it lived at on earth. And so this might be similar to different levels of hell or heaven, which is an idea that Dante uses in the Inferno and Paradiso. So reincarnation is another idea that is not really accepted by Boethius per se, but was part of Neoplatonic philosophy by Plotinus. And by the way, in case there's any confusion, we talked about it was introduced by the philosopher Plotinus, but it was based on the philosophy of Plato. So Plotinus was a student of Plato, and he kind of recasts Plato's philosophy in a more religious way than it had previously been interpreted by most scholars of Plato. Okay, so reincarnation. And all this stuff does come from Plato originally. You can find this stuff in his writings. Plotinus just, there's different ways to interpret his writings, obviously, and Plotinus takes a more religious interpretation of Plato than a lot of other scholars had. So in several different places in his writings, including in the Republic, Phaedo, and some of his dialogues, Plato expresses a belief in that souls are reincarnated, with the most pure souls dwelling in the highest regions. Impure souls are purified before being reincarnated into a new body, possibly an animal. This is not really compatible with Christianity and was not adopted by Christians who were Neoplatonists. But it is interesting because you think about, like, for instance, Hindus believe in reincarnation, very similar to this. And it makes you wonder if Plato somehow maybe had influenced Hindus somewhere along the way. Or either that or maybe he was influenced by Hindus. But apparently the idea of reincarnation was somewhat widely believed by the ancient Greeks. And so the ancient Greeks weren't Christian, and they were pagans, and they had a lot of different beliefs. So it's not a huge surprise that they had some beliefs that were completely incompatible with Christianity. But this one of the more famous ones of Plato's tales where he talks about reincarnation is the myth of Ur. And in the myth of Ur, each person that has died is choosing, they're kind of standing in line waiting to choose what their next life will be. And they all choose, some of them choose to be kings or wealthy or rich or famous and all kinds of things. So a lot of this would relate to what Boethius is talking about. And actually he does kind of mention the myth of Ur in book 3. Then Odysseus comes last of all. Odysseus gets to choose last, and there's not much less to choose from because all the lives have been chosen already, at least all what seems to be the really good ones. But Odysseus chooses, he searches around, he finds the life of a simple farmer who just basically works the land. He's not famous, he's not rich, but he just has enough to survive. And he chooses that life, and then after he's chosen it, he tells everybody, he says, I would have chosen the exact same thing, even if I had been the very first to choose. And so Odysseus is someone who had already been rich and famous and a king, and he knew that none of that stuff was satisfactory, and that real satisfaction would come from living a simple life, removed from the complications of politics and wealth, just working and being at home with your family and not constantly away. And so there was some wisdom in that. All right, so then other things in Neoplatonic philosophy, hierarchy. There are multiple levels of being, with the physical universe at the lowest level. Each level is derived from the level above it, and each level is an image of the level above it. So Gnosticism used this idea as one of its prime truths, but it is generally rejected by Christians. But Gnosticism was a heresy that came out of early Christianity, and so there is some relation there. The material world is considered by Neoplatonists to be good and beautiful, and is a product of divine power. And of course, Christians can wholeheartedly believe that, and definitely Boethius points this out. And the soul's return to God. The soul must return to God by eliminating material things from its being, thoughts, and actions. And so this is another idea I think that Boethius kind of uses in his writings, the idea that eliminating bad thoughts and actions from our life will help us to return to God. So Neoplatonism is a philosophy that combined Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism and had a significant impact on Christianity. Many of the ideas of Neoplatonism were adopted by Christian thinkers as useful. Others were rejected. So early Christians like Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and Augustine were influenced by Neoplatonism. Augustine's conversion to Christianity from Manichaeism was influenced by Neoplatonism. He adopted many Neoplatonic ideas, such as the incorporeality of God and the human soul, but eventually moved away from Neoplatonic beliefs. Part of his concern as he got older and was that Neoplatonic beliefs were also involved in many of the heresies that he was fighting against. And so he saw that there might be some harm in them. A lot of the Greek philosophical terms that Neoplatonists used were also later used by Thomas Aquinas. He continued to use Greek philosophical terms and Neoplatonic ideas to express Christian beliefs. So regarding creation, Neoplatonists believe that the universe is eternal, while Christians believe that God created all things. But Neoplatonists do believe, and obviously, you know, when Christians like St. Augustine or Boethius are looking at Neoplatonist ideas, they're looking at it just like they look at any other philosophy that's made by pagans. They take the good and they use that, and they reject the parts that are wrong, that are obviously erroneous, or that are contradictory to the scriptures or to the church teaching. And then evil. Neoplatonists believe that evil is a privation of good. So in other words, this relates real strongly to one thing that Boethius says in Book 3, which is that evil does not exist because God cannot do it. So evil is just the lack of good, basically, which is exactly what Neoplatonists would say.